Welcome back to the Grace Students Podcast, where we are continuing, and this is gonna be our final part of this series on relationships. And so, stay tuned, Grace Students Podcast. Welcome back to the Grace Students Podcast. My name is Scott, and thank you so much. I really hope that you've been enjoying this series as much as we've enjoyed putting it together. I am joined once again by Brian Curdy.
What's up, guys?
And Geraldine and Carly. Thanks for joining us again.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
And today we're wrapping up. And so, Brian, do you want to kind of preface how we're going to tie the last three topics together and move forward?
Yeah, so we'll say that if you're coming up on this podcast and you've not seen the previous three, I would encourage you to go back and start with part one a few episodes ago, and so you kind of have some context for this. But if you don't want to do that and you've not seen any of the other ones, we've talked a little bit about how we can find our identity in our relationships with other people, specifically our dating relationships, where we can begin to see our worth based on what people do for us, how they treat us, and that can then cause us to respond in ways that tries to earn that worth or tries to validate that person's opinions of us. And then in the most recent episode, we talked about the idea of putting too much weight on our spouses or our boyfriends, our girlfriends, and trying to find so much satisfaction in that relationship that we just begin to pursue that person instead of Jesus. And so what we wanted to do in this final episode is kind of tie everything together and say, what does gospel-centered dating look like, right? Like, what would it look like to date with the gospel as our primary motivating factor? And if we are pursuing Jesus, how would that show up in our dating relationships? Which is a tough question, I think, because that could look different for everybody. But basically what we wanted to do is just kind of start the conversation and just talk around the table a little bit about that. So what's your guys' thoughts? What do you think? What would it look like to be gospel-centered in your dating relationship?
Well, do we need to define what gospel-centered living actually looks like?
That's a great point.
That's a really good point.
Do you want to do that?
I mean, sure.
Give us your 30-second definition of gospel-centered living.
Gospel-centered living is, I think, living for Jesus.
All right, 5-second definition. We're good.
And done.
Just making him primary, but like realistically and what that actually looks like in a day-to-day life, I think is it's all in perspective and focus. I think at least that's how it plays out in my life. When I'm gospel-centered, focused, focusing on the correct stuff, desiring to follow Jesus, desiring to get to know him, then that changes and affects everything else that I'm doing.
Yeah, so, I mean, the nutshell of the gospel is the good news is who God is and what he's done, right? So who God is in creation and creating us in his image, in pursuing us because of the fall, because we have fallen into sin. We're in need of grace. We need to be made alive again. And so redemption happens, and then he pursues us. He sends Jesus, and then he makes us into a new creation as a result of what he's done. So who God is and what he's done impacts our dating relationships, right? It impacts our marriage relationships. And so, yeah, that's a great point. Like, gospel-centered living means that we are informed and influenced and led by who God is and what he's done. And so then our response to that is based on who God is and what he's done. We then have things to do because of that, right? Like, he has made us to be in his image. He has redeemed us. He has pursued us. He has made us alive in Christ. And then, so how do we live, right? How do we live in light of who God is and what he's done? So it's a great clarification.
Yeah.
So what would it look like to reflect that in our dating relationships?
I think the thing that we've kind of talked about before is that you need to be for the other person, and so you need to, and this goes for kind of every relationship, whether it's friend or, for a dating, but you need to be for that person. You need to be able to speak good truth to them and be able to just help them navigate life's troubles and turmoils and the ups and the downs. And so I think one of the things that you could measure, a gospel relationship by is how well are you speaking, how are you communicating Jesus' truth to your significant other. But that kind of raises another question for me, and so I'd like to hear your feedback if possible. Does that mean
No.
as a follower of Jesus, you should only date other followers of Jesus?
Yes.
Short answer, yes. That's a loaded question as well.
Yeah. Maybe we can get into that another time, though.
Episode
I mean,
5.
I think to have a gospel-centered relationship, you both have to be pursuing Jesus,
Right.
right? So if you're both pursuing Jesus, then it would be safe to say that you're both Jesus followers.
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes, because you can't have the same priorities if you're not.
Right.
I think that's why it says too, you should not marry an unbeliever.
Right.
Like, because how can you have a, I don't know, I don't know if satisfying is the right word, but how can you have a good or satisfying relationship with someone if you're not pursuing the same thing?
Right. Yeah, and I think it goes way deeper than does this person go to church. You know.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of people who go to church that aren't Jesus followers.
Right. Absolutely. and so how are you going to pursue Jesus if this person that you are spending so much time with and investing so much in could care less about that?
Yeah.
You're not. That's the answer to that. You're not going to.
And so that's why I think communicating and having some serious, not that you need to like drop the hammer on like the very first date, but like you need to build and you need to understand questions to ask, and you need to be able to listen to them to see kind of where they're coming from and hinting at, where they truly stand, because you could easily say, like Carly said, oh yeah, I'm a Christian. Well, what does that even mean anymore? So yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's really difficult. I think for in the teen world, when you're bombarded a little bit with like so many options,
Yeah.
and you begin to have feelings, and like feelings get involved, and then you're trying to navigate those feelings, and then trying to seek Jesus. That it gets really difficult and sketchy, and sometimes I think you learn to justify it, and or maybe not learn to, but you work at justifying it and stuff. But that's when it's really two things. It's really important to start asking those really, really hard questions that you might not want to have answers to, and then also be in community with people, whether that's a small group leader, in the case of teens that we like to plug them into, or really godly seeking friends who can help guide, and friends who are for you will hopefully be able to speak to that end and speak truth to that, because in the long run, not being married to an unsaved believer, that will just create more difficulty later on in your life, when you're not pursuing the same thing.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point, because that's kind of goes back to how we can gauge whether or not we're finding satisfaction, or how we're identifying in a relationship. Because if you are finding yourself going after someone who's maybe not a follower of Jesus, and you're saying, and you start justifying, reasons why you should date this person,
Right.
Jesus is no longer the focus of your heart.
Right.
And so that's a really good point.
Right.
The other thing I would say is if you find that spending time with that person pulls you away from pursuing Jesus, that's a pretty good indicator that it's not gospel driven. Because if your goal is to spend more time with that person and you want to pursue a relationship with that person, but when you are, it's actually pulling you away from your pursuit of Jesus, then what's to say that's going to change later on, right? Like, I mean, we always want to think the best of people, but, if Jesus never comes up in conversation, then that's cause for us to say, okay, what am I thinking here? Because as much, like you said, nobody wants to have those conversations early on. You're like, oh, those are hard questions. But the deeper in you get, the harder it is to answer those honestly, because your feelings do get intertwined. And so I think to ultimately gospel-centered dating looks like pursuing Jesus first. So I mean, I guess this is a bold statement, but if you're not pursuing Jesus at all and you claim to be a Jesus follower, you shouldn't date anyone, right? Like you should, step one is pursue Jesus. And then from that flows your relationship with a boy or a girl.
Yeah.
And if you're like, no, I got time for that later, you don't.
Yeah, and don't count on a relationship to be the catapult for you to enter into a relationship with Jesus. Oh, well, they're a strong follower of Jesus, so I need that. No, like that's something you need to be praying to the Spirit to build in your heart that desire to follow. Because you don't want to put your faith on someone else. Like that's completely unfair.
Well, and something that I think is worth saying, especially as we kind of conclude our last few episodes on relationships, is that marriage is not designed to be the all-satisfying relationship, right? So here we said, each of us are in marriage relationships, and this is not the pinnacle, right? This is not like, oh man, once you get married, all of your struggles, they go away. Like you don't have to worry about like, it's easy to pursue Jesus first once you're married. Like, no, it's not. And so I think it's important to paint a realistic picture of marriage, in that it's difficult to follow Jesus when you're married too. It's not like, man, it sucks to date, and then once you get married, it'll be good.
Yeah.
It gets harder, because if you're really going to be for each other, you got to lean in and you got to dig in. And that's what Jesus wants, because it images his pursuit of us. But we also want to paint a realistic picture of what it's like.
Well, too, and I think it's really easy in a dating relationship to kind of be for each other for a short period amount of time, and then when you get married, all of that dirty junk just starts coming up to the surface. So it just gets harder as you keep going.
Yeah. Any final thoughts?
No.
All right. Well, we hope you've enjoyed
I have a lot of thoughts, but
all right,
not
so
for this.
at Jay, and she will respond.
Yeah.
No, really our purpose here was to begin the conversation, rather than, we certainly can't
End
say everything there is to say on this in our podcast time, but we want to begin the conversation with you guys, invite you into conversation with us. Reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you about this. We definitely don't sit here having figured everything out. That's not the position we're in. We are pursuing Jesus along with you. And so we want to just tell you to reach out. Give us some feedback on this. Let us know what you think. My Starbucks is gone, so I think we're out.
Yeah. We'll see you in the next episode.
See you guys.
See you guys.
Bye, guys.